just as the music was still echoing through the luxurious mansion. In Lagos, the young woman suddenly stepped forward without hesitation. Without a second thought, snatched a bucket of dirty mop water and poured it straight over the head of the elderly woman, kneeling on the cold marble floor. The filthy water soaked her silver hair, streamed down her wrinkled face, dripping onto the polished floor, like a humiliation that could never be erased. No one screamed, no one rushed to help. There were only a few laughs, soft, cruel, and in that moment, no one realized the woman kneeling on that floor was not a housemaid, and what just happened was not just an insult. It was a mistake that would destroy the young woman's entire life. Because in this world, there are people you think are beneath you until the truth rises and turns everything upside down. If you've ever witnessed disrespect or been judged for less than your true worth, stay until the end of this story, because the ending will stay with you. And if you believe that karma is real, whether it comes early or late, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Before we begin, drop a comment. Where are you watching from in the world? And now, take a quiet breath and listen carefully as the story begins from the very moment a bucket of dirty water was poured and the truth began to rise. A few hours earlier, the mansion set along one of the wealthiest streets in Lagos was glowing like a stage prepared for people who believed money could make everything perfect. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the high ceiling, reflecting off cream-colored walls, and marble floors polished so flawlessly they mirrored every passing silhouette. Soft jazz music drifted through every corner, blending with the scent of expensive perfume, red wine, and freshly served dishes from the grand kitchen in the back. Everything was beautiful, almost artificially so. Beautiful enough to make anyone who stepped inside feel the need to smile, to speak carefully, to wear a mask worthy of such luxury. Tonight was Isha's deathbed. Her name floated through the room like an invisible ornament. People mentioned her with admiration laced with flattery, as if she were not just a woman entering a wealthy family, but a living symbol of ambition, beauty, and calculated elegance among the city's young elite. Isha appeared at the top of the grand staircase in a champagne-colored evening gown that hugged her figure, shimmering under the lights. Every step she took was soft, precise, and confident, as if she had walked through this exact moment 100 times in her imagination before turning it into reality. The smile on her lips was flawless down to the millimeter, not too wide to seem showy, not too faint to seem cold, just enough to convince everyone she was refined, educated, and born to belong in a place like this. Men looked at her with fascination. Women offered polite smiles, but their eyes quickly assessed everything from her hair, her earrings, the way she held her glass, to the cost of the heels, gliding across the marble floor. Isha understood all of it. She had lived long enough in a world where women were not just seen, but measured by the value they could bring to a family, a name, a deal, a future. And tonight, she had decided she would win. She tilted her head and smiled at an older guest, lightly touched the shoulder of a powerful woman near the bar, exchanged clever words with her fiancé's friends. Every gesture was calculated with precision, like she was placing pieces on the chessboard of her life. No one could see the calculation, because Isha wrapped it in a softness so feminine that ambition could easily be mistaken for charm. But at that very moment, in a quiet corner near the glass doors overlooking the garden, there was someone almost no one noticed. An elderly woman. She wore a worn gray housemaid's uniform, the sleeves slightly faded with time. Her silver hair was neatly tied at the back. In her hands was a mop and a plastic bucket, half filled with murky water, carrying a faint scent of cleaning solution that felt out of place in the air, thick with luxury fragrances. She moved slowly, silently, bending down to wipe away every footprint on the marble floor, as if her presence was meant to be nothing more than a passing shadow. No one introduced her. No one asked her name. No one looked at her for more than a second. To most of the guests, she was simply part of the house, like the velvet curtains, the silver trays, or the servers quietly refilling their glasses. She existed, but she was not seen. She was there, but not acknowledged as a person with a story, with dignity, with thoughts, with eyes that could observe. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all. Because in the most luxurious places, cruelty rarely begins with shouting. It begins with treating someone like air. The old woman continued mopping, yet her aged eyes were far from dull. They were calm, sharp, observing everyone with a silence that felt almost unsettling. She watched the guests who laughed too loudly at uninteresting stories, the handshakes that lingered just a second too long for business advantage, the polite smiles hiding comparison, envy, calculation. And she watched Isha more than anyone else, not with the curiosity of a maid observing the wealthy, but with the gaze of someone reading a book, turning each page slowly, waiting to see where the main character would reveal her true nature. Isha felt it. At first, it was just a fleeting sensation, like stepping into an air-conditioned room and suddenly feeling a colder draft brush against your neck. She was speaking with a few guests when her eyes instinctively drifted toward the corner. There, the old woman was bent over, wiping a small spill near a table leg. She didn't look up. She said nothing. But somehow, that quiet presence unsettled Isha. She frowned slightly, very slightly. No one else noticed. A woman like Isha had been trained never to lose composure in public. But inside her, a vague irritation had begun to rise. She didn't like anything that disrupted the perfect composition of this evening. She didn't like the presence of anything that dragged down the elegance. And more than anything, she didn't like the feeling of being watched silently, without judgment spoken aloud, yet piercing enough to make her feel exposed. She turned away, lifting her glass to her lips, continuing her perfect performance. But minutes later, as she passed near the hallway, she saw the old woman again. Still the mop, still the bucket, still that slow, bent posture. A male guest had accidentally spilled a bit of sauce on the floor, and the woman immediately stepped in to clean it before anyone could notice. No complaint, no sigh, just near-perfect silence. Aisha glanced at the worn clothes, the faded slippers, the veined hands gripping the mop handle. A small but sharp sense of contempt brushed through her. It came too quickly, too familiarly, like a reflex, deeply embedded in how she judged people. In her world, those without power had no value. Those who couldn't elevate her image did belong in her frame. And that woman, in Aisha's eyes, was a flaw on the polished surface of this evening. At that moment, the old woman finally looked up. Their eyes met just for a second. Aisha expected the usual reaction from someone of lower status. Avoidance, lowered gaze, quiet submission. But the old woman did none of that. She simply looked. Calm. Deep, so deep that Aisha felt, for a split second, as if she had been stripped of her shimmering gown, her flawless makeup, her carefully crafted smile revealed in the raw arrogance she always kept hidden. Aisha was the one who looked away first. She smiled at the person in front of her, but there was now a cold edge in her eyes. The old woman, meanwhile, lowered her gaze again and continued mopping, as if nothing had happened, as if she didn't need to do anything at all, as if she were simply waiting. Waiting for a word, waiting for a glance, waiting for a small moment, just enough for a person's true nature to step into the light. And, in that mansion filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and glittering congratulations, no one realized that this evening had long stopped being just a party. It was a test, and the first person about to fail was the one who believed she was shining the brightest. Aisha didn't like imperfections. It wasn't just a preference. It was almost a belief she had built into a personal law long ago. Everything around her had to be clean, beautiful, orderly, elevated, and worthy of display. From the way a man stood beside her, the car that pulled up at the entrance, the type of wine glass placed in her hand, to even the kind of people allowed to exist within the frame of her life. Everything had to align with the image Isha had so carefully constructed, polished, refined, always just a little above everyone else, even if she never said it out loud. And that elderly woman with her worn uniform, neatly tied gray hair, and faded slippers was the kind of presence that felt like a stain on a perfect mirror. Aisha had tried to ignore it, at least for the first few minutes. She kept smiling, kept clinking glasses, kept letting her fiancé introduce her to important names in Lego's business circle. Every compliment, every admiring glance, every warm handshake deepened her smile and fed her confidence like strong liquor. She felt like she was winning. Winning against the women, quietly comparing themselves to her. Winning against the men, who once thought she had only beauty. And winning against the mansion itself, the place that tonight was supposed to acknowledge she was born to belong here. But then it happened, something small. So small that, for someone else, it might have meant nothing at all. As Aisha walked past the base of the staircase, where golden light spilled across the marble floor in soft, honey-like patches, the old woman, bent over cleaning a stain nearby, gently moved her mop. Just a normal motion. Brushed. Light. Routine. But from the damp cloth, a single drop of grayish water flicked upward and landed on the edge of Isha's dress. A tiny spot, very small. But against the expensive champagne-colored fabric, it stood out like a slap. Isha froze. Her entire body stilled amid the music, the half-finished conversations, the drifting glances of guests, who hadn't yet realized anything was wrong. She lowered her eyes to the hem of her dress. Sht! The stain spread slowly, as if deliberately extending the insult for a few extra seconds. Then she lifted her head, slowly enough that those nearby instinctively turned to look. She turned toward the old woman. Her eyes were no longer polite. They had gone cold, thin, sharp as glass. "Can't you see where you were going?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was just enough to slice through the nearby space like a fine blade. A few people near the bar stopped talking. A man mid-laugh fell silent. A middle-aged woman glanced over, sensing trouble. The music still played, but within a few meters of them, the air suddenly tightened. The old woman looked up. Not hurried, not panicked, not flustered like a servant might be when confronted in a room full of elites. She simply raised her head, her calm eyes briefly noting the stain, then meeting Aisha's face. "I'm sorry, miss, that was all. No excuses, no explanation, no pleading, no trembling." And that calmness irritated Aisha even more. Because the apology didn't carry the submission she expected. It didn't feel like it came from someone beneath her. It sounded like a polite acknowledgement offered simply because she had the decency not to escalate the situation, not because she felt inferior. And Aisha hated that. She hated the feeling of not being able to fully step on someone. She hated that a woman dressed like a servant could look at her with such steady eyes. A thin smile formed on Aisha's lips. Not the smile she used to greet guests. Not the smile of elegance. This one belonged to someone who had just found a target for the sharpness, already waiting inside her. "Sorry," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "You think saying sorry is enough?" A few more people turned to watch. No one stepped in. That was how it usually worked in elegant rooms. People loved witnessing humiliation as long as it wasn't theirs. The old woman didn't move. One hand rested on the mop handle, the other holding the worn gray bucket. "I didn't mean to," she said softly, her voice low and steady. "I am sorry for staining your dress." That should have ended it. But for Aisha, this was no longer about the dress. This was an opportunity. An opportunity to show everyone in the room where she stood. An opportunity to stamp her authority onto the very floor the woman was kneeling to clean. She glanced around quickly, but enough to see that people were watching. And that attention made her want to continue. Deep down, Aisha understood something fundamental. Power isn't what you have. Power is what you make others see. "Be more careful," she echoed, as if she had just heard something ridiculous. "Do you even know how much this dress costs?" No one answered. Of course, no one answered. The question was meant to be answered. It was a trap forcing the other person to acknowledge the distance between them. The old woman looked at her. Then, "Staying I done to know," she replied. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Aisha let out a soft, dry laugh. "Of course you done tea." The words fell like cold water. They weren't tea loud or openly rude. They were worse, delivered with just enough politeness to disguise the contempt. That kind of cruelty didn't need shouting to humiliate. It was quiet, controlled and chilling. Nearby, a young woman covered her mouth, unclear whether in shock or to hide a smile. A middle-aged man looked away, unwilling to be involved. Two servers stood frozen beside their tray, eyes lowered. Aisha's fiancé, across the room, was still occupied with guests, unaware of what was unfolding. Everything aligned so that no one would stop her. Aisha stepped forward. Her shimmering dress brushed against the polished floor. The sharp sweetness of her perfume filled the air in front of her, clashing with the faint scent of cleaning solution around the old woman. One stood beneath the chandelier's glow, the other beside a worn plastic bucket. The contrast was painfully clear. "You should know where you are," Aisha said, her voice dropping. "And you should know who to step aside for." The old woman didn't respond. Didn't he argue? Didn't he apologize again? She simply stood there, looking at Aisha. A strange kind of silence. Not weak, not afraid. It felt as though she was giving Aisha time to go further, to reveal more, to push herself to a point of no return. But Aisha did to see it that way. To her, that silence felt like defiance. Something hot and dark began rising inside her. Not exactly anger over the stain, but the discomfort of someone who needed to control every scene, now disrupted by a plainly dressed old woman on the most important night of her life. Her pride wouldn't allow her to stop at a sharp remark. Not when people were watching. Not when the silence itself had turned into a stage. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Not everyone was close enough to hear every word, but somehow the energy had spread. Laughter faded. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted in the same direction. Everyone sensed something was being pushed too far, and that made it impossible to look away. Aisha lowered her gaze to the bucket at the woman's feet. The water inside was murky gray, bits of dust floating under the light. She looked at the mop, then back at the woman. An idea flashed through her mind, quick, sharp, and frightening in the way it curved her lips. Before she even realized what she was thinking, this was the moment when contempt stopped being just an attitude. It was about to become action. And the most dangerous part was that Aisha didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as asserting her place, to teaching someone to know their position, showing the entire room who truly belonged in this world of luxury. The old woman still stood there, calm, as if she could already see the storm approaching, but refused to step back. Around them, the silence thickened, heavy enough that you could hear a glass being set down somewhere. Heavy enough that everyone understood the next moment would decide whether this night remained a party or became something no one would ever forget. And Aisha finally reached for the bucket. The front door opened at the exact moment the room had barely begun to recover from the shock of what had just happened. No one knew who turned first. Maybe it was a guest standing frozen with a wine glass in hand. Maybe it was one of the servers pressed against the wall, too afraid to intervene from beginning to end. Or maybe it was Aisha herself, still standing there, chest rising and falling, her hand hanging loosed, after throwing the last piece of her humanity onto the marble floor, along with the bucket of dirty water. But whoever it was, everyone turned in the same direction as the tall, heavy front door, framed in polished brass, slowly opened. A man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, with sharp features, and the quiet authority of someone so used to power that his mere presence could shift the gravity of a room. Outside, The headlights had just gone dark. The cool trace of night still clung to his shoulders. Perhaps he had come straight from the airport, or just walked out of a meeting, where numbers large enough to stun ordinary people had been discussed as casually as the weather. But none of that mattered, because the moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped. His eyes swept across the crowd, across the pale faces, across the unnatural silence in a party that should have been overflowing with laughter. And then his gaze stopped, on the marble floor in the center of the grand hall, where an elderly woman stood in a soaked maid's uniform, her silver hair plastered down with dirty water, the last drops still sliding slowly along her cheeks and collar. And in front of her stood Isha, in her dazzling gown, standing like a statue that had just realized she was not on a stage at all, but at the edge of a cliff. The man frowned, just slightly, but it made the entire room seem to contract. What happened here? His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. There was a roughness at the end of the sentence, as if even he could hardly believe the scene in front of him. For a moment, no one answered. Not one of the people who, only minutes earlier, had laughed, stared, or chosen silence for their own safety now dared to speak. They looked at one another, then at Isha, then at the old woman, then back at the man who had just entered. Isha parted her lips. Maybe she was about to say something. Maybe she was going to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, a moment of anger, a brief lapse in control. But before any excuse could fully take shape, another voice cut through the room. The butler stepped forward from the right side of the hall. No one knew how long he had been standing there. His back was straight, white gloves on his hands, his dark gray suit immaculate, his expression so stern it was nearly emotionless. He looked directly at the man who had just arrived, but every word he spoke landed in the room for everyone to hear. She is the owner of this house. The air froze, not ordinary silence, but the kind that happens when truth crashes into a crowd and shatters everything they believed just seconds before. A glass slipped from someone's hand at the far end of the room, hit the floor, shattered. The sound was sharp and small, yet it rang out like the first crack in a collapsing building. Aisha didn't blink. She looked at the butler, then at the man, then slowly turned back to the elderly woman, standing in front of her, as if for the first time truly seeing her. No longer an old servant in a faded uniform. No longer a shadow bent over the floor with a mop. No longer something imperfect that had ruined her elegant picture. The woman was standing very straight. Her clothes were still wet. Her hair still clung to her skin with dirty water. But in that moment, everything ordinary Isha thought she had seen on her fell away, revealing something money could never buy and performance could never fake. The absolute authority of someone who did not need to raise her voice to make an entire room bow. "That's impossible," Isha whispered. Her voice was so small it barely sounded like a voice at all. The man took another step into the hall. His gaze shifted from Aisha's face to the elderly woman, and the moment he saw her, clearly under the chandelier light, his expression changed completely. Mother, just that one word, but it was enough to make every remaining mask in the room fall away. No one breathed too hard. No one dared move. At some point, someone hurriedly turned off the music in the corner, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than a scream. Aisha stepped back half a pace, only slightly, but enough for the heel of her shoe to catch a patch of water on the floor and slip. She regained her balance, but to everyone watching, that tiny stumble looked like the first moment a self-crowned queen realized her throne had never existed. "Mother," the man said again, lower this time, his voice tighter, as if something inside his chest had just clenched. "Who did this to you?" No one answered. No one needed to. The whole room already knew, and that knowledge was more brutal than any accusation. Aisha looked around, at the faces that had smiled at her, raised glasses to her, looked at her as the star of the evening. Now not one of them stood with her. Their expressions had changed. Some were horrified. Some were cold. Others wore the silent satisfaction of people who had always been waiting to see how painfully an arrogant person would fall. In less than a minute, Isha's position in the room had been completely reversed. She was no longer the admired woman. She was the spectacle, the lesson, the living cost of an act she had assumed would be overlooked. The butler bowed his head slightly toward the elderly woman. I apologize for allowing this to happen before I could intervene. No one dared question it anymore. No one dared doubt it anymore. The pieces began snapping together in their minds with horrifying speed. That elderly woman was not a maid. She was the new owner of the mansion, the woman who had quietly bought the property, the shares, the control things most of the people in that room had not even yet been informed about. She was the woman behind the name of the man who had just entered, and worst of all, she had chosen to appear dressed as a maid, not because she had to, but because she wanted to see clearly. She wanted to know who the woman about to enter her family truly was beneath the makeup, the elegance, the education, and the beautiful words. Aisha swallowed hard. Her throat was so dry it burned. The past few hours rewound in her mind like a cruel film reel. The old woman's calm gaze, the apology that never trembled, the silence that had felt almost expectant, and that strange sense that she had been seen through before she ever had the chance to shine. It wasn't tea that the old woman had fought back. She simply hadn't needed to, because people with real power never argue with arrogance. They just stand still and let arrogance destroy itself. Aisha wanted to say something, that she didn't know, that she thought the woman was only a servant, that she didn't mean. But the moment the thought formed, even she could feel how pathetic it was. Because the truth was not that she had humiliated the wrong important person. The truth was that she had been perfectly willing to humiliate someone she believed was unimportant, and that was the real sin. Aisha's face turned ghostly pale. There was no warmth left beneath her makeup, no sparkle left from the woman who thought she had won. Her lips trembled. Her arms hung at her sides, empty and useless. It was as if all the air had been pulled from her body, leaving only the shape of a woman who had just heard the door of her future slam shut in front of her. At last, the elderly woman lifted her eyes and looked directly at her. There was no shouting, no slap, no explosion of rage like everyone had expected. Just a look, more sorrow than anger, deeper than hurt. As if what pained her most was not the bucket of dirty water that had just been poured over her head, but the fact that a young, beautiful, educated woman standing beneath lights and music could choose cruelty so easily. Her son stood there in silence, his eyes never leaving Isha. There was no confusion left in them now, only a disappointment so heavy it made the whole room struggle to breathe. And Isha understood. In that instant, she understood that everything was over. Not the party, not the debut, but the future she had believed she already held in her hands. The mansion was still brilliantly lit. The wine glasses were still on the tables. The flowers still smelled sweet. But the room had become something entirely different. It was no longer a place where a young woman could step in as the heroine of an upper-class dream. It had become a courtroom, and the verdict had already been delivered without another word. She stepped forward. Just one step, but in the absolute silence of the grand hall, it landed heavier than any shout. Dirty water was still dripping from her silver hair, falling slowly onto the polished marble floor, like the final punctuation marks on a performance that had just ended. Her old maid's uniform still clung to her body, wet, cold, and wrinkled, exposing the cruel contrast between her outward appearance and the real power standing inside that seemingly fragile frame. But now, no one saw the clothes anymore. No one saw the worn slippers. No one saw the mop and the bucket resting quietly at her feet. The only thing people saw was the presence of a woman who did not need to raise her voice to make an entire room lower its head. She looked straight at Isha. There was no fury in her eyes, no noise, no cruel satisfaction, the kind some people feel when they watch another person fall. Her gaze was tired, sad, and cold, the coldness of someone who had seen too clearly the true nature of a person others had tried to wrap in velvet, perfume, and beautiful smiles. Aisha stood frozen in the middle of the hall. Her face had turned so pale that even her makeup could not save it. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but every word died in her throat before it could come out. Because in this moment, she understood that no sentence was powerful enough to pull her back to where she had been. No explanation could bend the truth. No elegance could cover the ugliness she herself had just exposed in front of everyone. Then the older woman spoke. "I do not need your apology." Her voice was low, slow, and not loud, but every word fell with the clarity of something carved into the air. The whole room seemed to stop breathing. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Some guests were still standing there with wine glasses in their hands, not even realizing how tightly their fingers had clenched around the stems. The staff along the walls lowered their heads even more. The butler remained still as stone, and her son, the man who had walked into the chaos, stood there with a heavy face, as if even he had not yet fully recovered from the shock of the truth crashing down in front of him. She kept her eyes on Aisha. "All I need," she continued, pausing for a beat, "is for you to leave my house." No shouting, no explosion of rage, no dramatic revenge scene like the ones people love to tell. Just a short sentence, but it carried the weight of a sentence being passed. Aisha blinked, slowly, as if her mind needed several seconds to fully understand what those words meant. Leaving this house did not simply mean walking out the door. It meant being cast out of everything she thought she was about to gain. Out of status, out of the protection of a powerful family, out of the luxurious future she had painted for herself with so much calculation. In one sentence, the older woman had not merely asked her to step outside. She had erased Aisha from the world she had longed to enter. Aisha turned to look at the son. She needed him to say something. Just one sentence, a word in her defense, a word of intervention, a word that might prove she had not lost everything. But he did not look at her. His eyes stayed on his mother, her silver hair, still wet, her narrow shoulders thin, but straight, her face calm in a way that was almost painful to see. And on that man's face was something more terrifying than anger, disappointment, deep, heavy, beyond repair. It was not the expression of a man angry that his fiancée had ruined a party. It was the expression of a man who had just realized he had nearly brought a cruel person into the center of his family. Aisha felt her heart drop. I didn't know, she finally managed, her voice trembling, weak now, stripped of every trace of pride. "I thought she was just..." She stopped, because at that exact moment, she heard how disgusting that sentence sounded. Just, a word that had once come so easily to her, a word that had once been enough to let her treat another person as if they had no value. But now, in front of the entire room, that word revealed itself for what it really was. A blade sharp enough to strip the moral mask from her face. The older woman did not let her finish. "That is exactly the problem," she said, still in that same calm voice. "You believed that if someone had no power, you were free to humiliate them. No one dared breathe too hard." She continued, her eyes never leaving Aisha. "You are not wrong because you failed to recognize who I am." She paused. "You are wrong because you believed that someone you thought was beneath you deserved to be crushed." Those words did not need to be sharp, because truth by itself was already sharp enough. Aisha stood there, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides. Her whole body seemed drained of strength. The sparkling dress, the expensive heels, the perfectly styled hair, the flawless makeup, everything that only hours earlier had made her look like a winner now felt ridiculous. None of it made her look elegant anymore. It only made her collapse more visible. The people around her were looking at her differently now. There was no admiration left, no envy, no expression reserved for a woman about to rise into a new level of life. Now they looked at her the way people look at a lesson, a living warning. Some eyes held cold contempt, others open judgment. A few tried to look away, but in doing so only made it more obvious that they wanted no part of her shame. No one stepped toward her. No one reached out a hand. No one said, "It was just a misunderstanding," or "Let's calm down." In rooms like this, loyalty usually lasts only until a person becomes a burden to the collective reputation. And that night, Aisha had become that burden. At last, the son moved. He stepped toward his mother, took off his suit jacket, and gently placed it over her shoulders. The gesture was not rushed, but it was enough to make more than one throat tighten in the room, because it was not merely an act of care. It was also a quiet but unmistakable declaration of where he stood. Aisha saw it, and in that moment, the last thing inside her broke, not because she had fully repented, but because she understood she had just lost the thing she thought she already possessed. She lost a powerful family. She lost that man. She lost the position she had spent so much calculation, manipulation, and practiced softness trying to reach. And the cruel irony was this: none of it had been taken from her by some outside scheme. It had been destroyed by her own hands, by her own words, by the bucket of dirty water she had poured over the head of someone she believed did not deserve respect. The butler stepped toward the door and opened it. The Lagos night appeared beyond it deep, quiet, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of trees, and the thin chill of evening after rain. The darkness outside stood in total contrast to the bright-lit hall. Behind her, like an invisible border between the world Aisha had tried to enter and the world she was now being sent back to. No one needed to repeat the order. No one needed to touch her. Aisha understood. She bent down and picked up the clutch purse lying near the table leg. Her movements were slow, stiff, almost mechanical. When she straightened again, she no longer dared look directly at anyone. The shoulders she had always held with such pride now seemed collapsed. Her heels clicked against the stone floor. Sht! A small sound that somehow felt unbearably lonely in the silence. She walked. One step, then another. Past the guests who had once raised glasses to celebrate her. Past the faces that had once smiled warmly. Now they were nothing but walls of eyes. Cold. Closed. No longer opening for her. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated for a second, as though waiting for someone to call her name. Maybe for the sun. Maybe for some foolish miracle. But behind her, no voice came. Only silence. The kind of silence that says more than any rejection. At last, the son turned his face away. Without a word. That was the deepest cut of all. Because if he had shouted at her, perhaps she could have clung to emotion. If he had raged, perhaps it still would have meant she held some place in his heart. But he only turned away, as if the woman who had stood in the middle of the party and humiliated his mother was no longer worth even one more word. Aisha stepped across the threshold, out into the night. The evening air touched her skin like ice. The dress was still beautiful. The shoes were still expensive. Her face was still flawlessly made up. But everything was different now. She was no longer someone who belonged here. No longer the radiant center of the party. No longer the future of a wealthy family. She was only a woman descending the mansion's steps, in complete solitude, carrying the heaviest price of contempt, losing everything because she believed another human being did not deserve to be treated like one. Behind the slowly closing door, the older woman stood still beneath the lights, her silver hair still damp, her gaze unwavering. She had not won in the way the world usually imagines victory. She did not laugh at the fallen. She did not spit out cruel words, because she understood something many people spend nearly an entire lifetime trying to learn. That true status in life is not measured by how high you stand, but by how you treat those who can offer you nothing. And true character is not revealed when everything is easy. It reveals itself in the moment you have the chance to look down on someone else. That night, many people left the mansion with stories to tell. They would talk about the beautiful young woman who almost became the daughter-in-law of a wealthy family. only to destroy her own future with her own hands. They would talk about the old woman who disguised herself as a maid to test someone's heart. They would talk about the bucket of dirty water, the silent grand hall, the judgment spoken in a calm voice. But the thing that stayed with them longest was not the shock. It was the lesson. Never look down on a human being because of the place they appear to hold. Because there are people quieter than you, simpler than you, more modest than you, yet their worth is so great that one moment of misplaced contempt is enough to cost you your entire world. And sometimes, the thing that destroys a life is not poverty, not failure, not even an enemy. It is unchecked arrogance in a moment when a person believes no one is watching. Some actions take only a second to happen. A look of contempt, a word of disrespect, a decision that seems insignificant, but the price you pay can last a lifetime. Because in life, you never truly know who the person in front of you is, but you always know who you are choosing to be. If it were you standing in that room, would you stay silent, step in, or turn away like everyone else? And where in the world are you watching this story from? Drop a comment. I'd love to read your answer. And if you believe that, true character is revealed in how we treat those who are more vulnerable than us. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next story will make you think even deeper.